thumbs up from Abigail. So welcome to this Conservative Home Fringe meeting with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, titled Low on Income, Low on Trust, How Can the Conservatives Keep Hold of Voters Hit by the Cost of Living Crisis? I was having a chat before this meeting began to Frank, who is on the panel, and we agreed that actually voters affected by the cost of living crisis can be almost everyone. So therefore, this discussion of all the panels I've had so far is the most obviously purely political. It could go almost anywhere, given the breadth of that group of voters and the depth and width of the issues involved. So I'm delighted to welcome the panel, and I will introduce them one at a time. They will speak for about 3 minutes each. I will ask a few questions, and then it will be over to you, and we'll wrap up in an hour. So first of all, welcome Bim, MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, of course a long-time contributor to Come Home.
Exactly.
Bim, welcome.
Well, Paul, thank you, and thank you all for being here. And it's great to be at a purely political panel. It's been lots of fun. This is a party conference after all. So look, it's my view that since, I'd say probably since the Scottish referendum, and particularly the Brexit referendum, there's been something in vogue amongst the commentariat, the people that fill our newspapers every day, by saying, well, you know, economics doesn't really matter, it's all about culture. And that's not to say that culture doesn't matter. Culture has always mattered as much as economics. But I think that that attitude, which definitely prevailed amongst my colleagues in Parliament, ended up meaning that we didn't focus enough, in my view, on the economic offer to the lower income voters who switched their vote towards voting Conservative. And we, to some degree, took the economics for granted and sort of said, well, yes, we know it matters, but the reason why they're switching over is culture, and let's give them more of that. And I think that's, as we've seen with the cost of living crisis, the people that are worst affected by it, almost by definition, are people with less money. And so they are the people who will be feeling the pinch in all sorts of ways, whether it be on mortgage payments if they have mortgages, whether it be on rental payments if they rent, even if they're in social housing. Again, if the cost of everything in the shops goes up enough, then you're really in difficulty. And how we need to be doing that over the next year is we need to make levelling up, which I'm glad we're seeing a return of the levelling up rhetoric at this conference. It's a shame we haven't been talking about it more over the last few months. I hope that we will continue to talk about it more. Needs to have an economic heart to it in terms of people's aspirations, and that is as much to lower income voters as it is to higher income voters as well, and show a way forward on the economy that speaks to them and the amount of money they take home every month, not over-rely, and I gently say this to other colleagues who I all love dearly, but not over-rely on what I'd say is a cultural appeal to certain low-income voters, and remember that economics is the heart and sine qua non of everything else that we do.
Bim, thank you very much. And next, I'm going to ask Frank from Joseph Rowntree to say a few words.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Bim. I half agree with what Bim just said, in the sense that one of the most notable trends of British politics over the last 30 years has been the growing support that the Conservative Party has won among a certain subset of working class voters. And the fact is, culture has played a role within that. I mean, starting even from within midway through Labour's last term, concerns about immigration, scepticism about successive Labour leaders, and then latterly getting Brexit done have driven that vote. However, I think something is now changing, and particularly since 2019, it's quite clear that whatever credit the Tory party has built up with that particular part of the electorate, they're on much shakier ground now, precisely because of what's happening with the economy. People are worried about their dignity, their ability to provide security to their family. They're worried about the state of the public realm. These are the issues that are going to define the next election for this particular group of voters. And with respect to like some of the other stuff going on at the conference, the rally yesterday and so on, none of that really speaks to the mood of where these people are. And if the Conservatives want to hold on to some of that support, then they're going to have to not play the old tunes, but start to play some new ones.
Thanks very much. Next, my old friend James Kanagasorian of Focal Data, who also writes regularly in the Times about electoral matters and psephology and all that. James.
Thanks, Paul, and hi, everyone. I'm going to go a bit left field here and just kind of make 3 points. The first is the kind of issue over lower income voters and the cost of living and inflation is actually a global one. And actually, you're seeing incumbent governments everywhere, left and right, come under political pressure, whether that's the New Zealand Labour Party, whether that's the Democrats, where it's a bit of a Death Star flaw there, whether that's this kind of Scottish government within the UK here. What we're seeing here is that incumbent governments are coming under pressure everywhere, so there's a degree of which we shouldn't be too parochial in the arguments that are being made. The second, I think, is a point I would make is about the difference between lower income and lower education, because I think there's been a degree of elision that has occurred. So a lot of the gains that have been made amongst the Conservatives, I think prior up to around 2019, have broadly been pretty concentrated amongst voters who don't have a university degree, but actually have very varying degrees of wealth. And actually there's strong evidence that in the south, east, southwest, eastern regions and the East Midlands, the gains that the Conservatives have made since 2001 have been concentrated amongst lower income voters. But actually the evidence is actually, as you move to the northeast and the northwest and the West Midlands, that actually it's more concentrated amongst people who have lower levels of education. So actually there's a bit of a toggle and there's a bit of a difference, and it's quite a subtle one. The third point I would make about to kind of address Frank's point directly, have the Conservative Party just simply let go of all their lower income voters. I think this has been a long story that preceded Brexit. Actually, the lower income gains started in 2005 under Michael Howard. And my sense is that the next election, there's going to be a lot of much more regional random variation by area. And there will be quite a few seats, which you characterize as lower income, that may be very marginal, but will stay Conservative, and others that won't. And I think what we're going to see is the reassertment of a lot of random regional variation. We've been through a very unique period of British politics of 5 years where demographics have been king. And actually, you've seen a lot of areas lose what's kind of locally unique to them, whether that's the Southwest, the Liberal Democrats, whether that's Norfolk and East Anglia, whether that's elements around North Wales and Clwyd. I think what we'll see is the reassertment of that. So I think basically the picture is going to get more complicated. Thanks.
And finally, Patrick English from YouGov.
Yes, not the advertised, no, so apologies for that. But I think this is a crucial debate when we think about what is the Conservative voter coalition going to look like at the next general election. We know a lot about what it was in 2019, and as James has quite correctly said, that coalition was markedly different from what it had been in previous elections. But I'd like to maybe kick off with a statistic. I'm from YouGov, after all. So ahead of that 2019 general election, and not to conflate income with class too much, but among voters that are in the C2, DE sort of social class category, we had 45% of those giving us a headline vote intention saying that they were going to vote for the Conservative Party. 45%. That figure is now 27. So when we say sort of keep hold of those voters who have been hit by the cost of living crisis, what do we mean by keep hold of? Is that keep hold of the 2019 coalition? Is it keep hold of where they're at now? And what does that look like building out forward? So another bit of research that we did at YouGov was about the cost of living segmentation model, which some of you might have seen. And what we found there was two very, very interesting groups who had been hit very hard by the cost of living crisis. We categorized them as the worried and suffering, and then another group was the cautiously hopeful strugglers. Now, both of them looked very similar economically. They were struggling to pay bills. They didn't have much savings. They didn't have much in terms of tangible assets, such as housing or cars, etc. But one thing divided them, which was very important and very interesting, which I've written in Con Home about, actually. And that was the fact that the cautiously hopeful strugglers were very optimistic about their future and about the future of the country going forward, in a way that the worried and suffering simply were not. Economically very similar, but in terms of their outlook, very different. And it was among that group that vote intention for the Conservatives was at its highest of all the segmented groups that we came across, even those retired, home-owning people for whom the cost of living crisis wasn't touching them too much. So there's something in that, and there's something in, I think, long-term hope and optimism that might offer the Conservatives some route back into getting in a good place with low-income voters and voters hit by the cost of living crisis.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So this conversation could go in any number of ways. I want to start off with three questions. One is really a sort of psephology question, one is an economic question, the other is a culture question, so one at a time. So first of all, the psephology question. James, you said that there's a subtle difference between lower income and lower education, right? To what extent is all this about age, given that older voters won't have been through higher education, and that there's very clearly a pattern whereby youngest voters don't vote Conservative, the oldest tranches have tended to. Somewhere in the middle, that's the kind of group that's up for play, and Patrick, you were segmenting them in the way that you were. So to what extent is age a huge driver in the election ahead, given the importance it plays in some very key issues like the supply of housing and the uneven distribution of wealth and prosperity throughout the country? Who wants to? Frank, do you want to go?
Oh, James first, or
James, yeah, James, why not?
Gives us all time to think.
Gives you all time to think.
Thanks, sir. I was thinking, oh gosh, how are we going to answer this? Let's give it to James.
James, yeah, what do you think?
Cool. Thanks, Paul. In terms of, is it an age line? A couple of things I'd say. First of all, the age curve is very striking in UK politics. It's also unprecedented. So, again, if you take a kind of international comparison, Canada actually has a reverse age curve. So the Canadian Conservative Party is likely to get back into government on the backs of younger voters, and Trudeau's likely to, if he does stay in power, will be back on the backs of older voters. Again, in the US, the age curve is actually more of a U-shaped curve. It's not an age curve. You know, millions of younger Americans vote Republican. Actually, over 65s in some areas are showing a predisposition towards the Democrats, and actually the middle are Republicans. So people are right to identify in the UK as age as being quite striking. It's very linear, basically, how old you are. But I don't think that's the whole story. So first of all, what does age co-vary with? In other words, what are the other things that move in lockstep with age? The first is density. So if you take the number of people who live per hectare in the UK, it broadly tracks age almost exactly, and actually that's a huge structural fact. So a lot of our politics is basically a density curve. So if you look at the UK and you look at where's red, where's blue, and where's yellow, it broadly follows like an ONS density map. And if you look at the colours from that aspect, so the greater the number of people in a conurbation per hectare, the more likely it is to be Labour, and that just changes. And all the most rural areas of the country, particularly in England, are Conservative. There are exceptions. Westmoreland, Lonsdale, North Wales, the areas that are Welsh-speaking, and obviously Scotland is different in that regard. So, first of all, yeah, it's not age. There are other things that co-vary with age, and also housing tenure. Second of all, I think the person who really nailed what's happened in UK politics, interestingly, I think, is Thomas Piketty, who's kind of the centre-left economist, who talked about the realignment of high-income and high-education individuals sitting on the right and low-income, low-education individuals sitting on the left and everyone in between. He talked a lot about the merchant right and the Brahmin left, and he said, look, the new kind of lodestars for the centre-right are typically people who have a very high ratio of income given their levels of education. And people on the left are typically people who have the least amount of money for the highest levels of education. And actually it's a toggle between the two, and then everyone else is in the middle, and they're kind of swing voters. So that would be my top of mind answer.
Anyone else want to comment on that? I mean, no one has to. Patrick,
I don't have too much to say, completely agree, but perhaps to pick up on one thing that was mentioned in passing twice, and that's housing and housing tenure. And that is something that is consistently coming through when we speak to voters and when we look at how voters are talking and thinking about the cost of living crisis, about their perceptions of the world, perceptions of fairness in society. And you can pretty much say, well, you know, if you own your house outright, you think that things aren't all that bad, to be honest. And if you don't, then you think things are particularly horrible. And that's a very, very, very strong sort of binary wedge you can put into a lot of things that we're polling and a lot of things that we're talking about in this panel. And it will break down very, very strongly across it. So perhaps, again, if we're looking for answers to the question posed, you know, a lot of people have said it, and I know that they've gone home right about it quite a lot, but housing could be a really powerful tool. And it could be a really powerful way to communicate with those who are struggling and for whom they don't see a lot in the Conservative Party right now as a way to say, well, you know what, perhaps there is something on offer for me here.
Ben, yours.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some work on this, and I think that when we think about younger voters, and I'm not talking about 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, I'm talking about people aged under 45, okay? And I was saying this at a panel yesterday, and I was frustrated. I was described as a frustrated millennial. I thought, gosh, didn't realise it was that bad. But the political point here, and I've followed, I mean, James mentioned it, the leader of the Canadian Conservatives has made an explicit pitch to younger voters. He talks about housing all the time. He puts the Trudeau's government under immense pressure about their failure to deliver opportunity, economic opportunity in housing, because Canada, despite its size, actually has similar housing pressures that you find in the UK in terms of income and the ratios for earnings to asset. And it's amazing how quickly he has shifted younger people behind him. Now, look, every country is different. It's important not to overread from another country, but it shows that if we have a very significant offer for housing, for lower income voters, for younger voters, accepting that those two things are not always exactly the same, then I think we could considerably increase our support as a party, not just at the next election, but over the next few elections. Because what I'm worried about is the Conservative Party just relying on this thing that we all tell ourselves, which is as people get older, they become more conservative. For millennial generations, this is not happening. And people really need to wake up to the fact that housing is one of the key. It's not the only thing, but it is one of the key things that we can do to offer to younger people a chance to build their economic future and build their families. Because unless we do that, we are not a Conservative Party worthy of the name.
Right.
Just on the point about age, I'd maybe start with where Patrick left off, which was we've sort of seen similar data when it comes to C2 voters in particular, which is they're probably just under half are theoretically open to voting for the Conservatives, a third of whom are currently unsure, and 20% of whom, if pressed, would say they'd vote tomorrow. So that's kind of the scope for kind of movement, possibly. But when you ask them what actually matters to them, it isn't as simple as just pensions. I mean, pensions are up there, but there are other questions like housing, finding good quality housing at affordable price, accessing NHS services, but not being able to afford the essentials like food and energy bills also comes up top. So I think there is an amalgam of both working age households who are just about keeping it together, as well as older voters within this group.
Just on the economics and politics, there was an economic experiment roughly a year ago under the previous Prime Minister. It wasn't obviously a success. There was a rally yesterday where part one of the message seemed to be that in some sense it somehow was a success, but we didn't notice it at the time. The other half of the message was that if those ideas were properly applied in future, they would have terrific cut-through with voters. So there's an alternative economic programme out there for the Conservatives. Bim, what do you think?
I think it's bananas. Sorry, I love my colleagues dearly. The problem is that even broken clocks can be right, occasionally. The thing that Liz was right about is the importance of economics to the country's future, and she should be commended for putting that absolutely front and centre. And obviously we can all debate about how best to do that. But where I think rhetorically and politically certain people who supported that whole agenda have got it very wrong is they have focused on ideology and process rather than outcomes for people, and thinking hard about what are the practical things that you need to do in order for those outcomes to be the case. Not just say, we know that it's true that if you cut taxes, you improve people's prosperity. We know that it's true, and not making hard choices, right? So yes, economics matters. Yes, growth matters, 100%, and they're right about that. But we need to have a much more sophisticated view of what are the things the government can practically do to help people's incomes go up, to reduce the tax burden on working people, to make sure that people can get homes of their own. All of these practical outcomes are what matter, not over-relying on saying supply-side reform lots doesn't practically impact on the voter politically, let alone the process of how to get there.
But Patrick, doesn't Liz Truss onto something? I mean, pretty evidently, the economic model doesn't feel like it's working. voters are pretty unhappy with it. She is positing an alternative. She's not wrong about the present economic model in outline. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I agree with John as well. Like, I think there's certainly no love for the current economic model among much of the population, and indeed, certainly even less among those who have been hit hard by the cost of living crisis. And so, in terms of identifying a problem, absolutely. But again, I would concur with the rest of the panel in terms of the solution put forward is not one that I think voters are particularly interested in. Look, what they keep telling us all the time is they are concerned about having enough money in their pockets to pay bills coming through their doors. And that means practical solutions, and it means tangible things, it means building stuff, and it means providing stuff, and it means reassuring and saying to those voters as a government, look, we get it, there's a crisis, in crisis times, government step up, here's what we're going to do. That's what they're looking for.
Yeah, fair.
Well, just to say, one of the, it seems, clearest points of consensus among the electorate at the moment is this is not necessarily the right time for tax cuts, and this is true across the income spectrum. And that is because people can see with their own eyes. There are many aspects of this country, many aspects of the public realm that no longer seem to be working. And instead, most people either sort of support current levels of spending and a protection of kind of existing levels of service and benefits, or they want to see an increase in taxes in order to kind of repair the state of that realm. So I think I don't understand, apart from some principled ideological stance, why that position is being laid out around tax cuts at the moment, because it's so completely far away from where the country is and the diagnosis that the voters have about what needs to be fixed.
James, where do you think the country is on tax? Because we ran recently a massive polling exercise by our proprietor, Lord Ashcroft, and in general terms, it's true that if you ask people abstract questions about the size of the state, most people wanted active government. But a striking finding I remember from it, looking ahead, was that if you ask people about the future, about a third of the sample prioritised higher spending, a third prioritised lower taxes, and they tended to be lower income voters, and a third prioritised reducing debt, and they tended to be higher income, more traditional conservative type voters. Do you think there's anything in that?
Definitely. I mean, one of the things I've seen from the polling in the last 10 years is there's been a realignment on social issues, but there has been a realignment on economic issues. So if I went back to the early stage Cameron years and conducted a poll to ask people who were most likely to be sceptical about a large size of the state, it would be older, kind of richer voters in kind of typically areas like Surrey. Remember, there was an academic called Chris Hanratty who once modelled by constituency the most right-wing constituencies in the country, and Surrey Heath came top. That is not the case now. And what's happened since then, actually, is that kind of lower income voters have proportionally become more sceptical of the state. And you're seeing in a lot of cities, particularly amongst higher income voters, particularly where their money comes from the public sector, they're much more supportive of a much larger state. And that's new. That hasn't always been the case. And that's obviously interacting with the social axis. So I think the complexity that you talk about, Paul, is definitely there. The economic polling of this country is a bit of a mess and quite hard to actually understand what's happening. And I think that's mainly because we've been involved in a kind of cultural conversation for the past 6 or 7 years. I think that polling may start to sharpen up as we move into an era of cost of living.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just to question back to you, James. I know it isn't James Kanagasoran question time, but why not? To what extent do you think that a lot of the cultural discussions and differences that exist are actually downstream of economics? So, you know, we talked about, for example, high-income voters in cities and big towns, particularly often if you go further north you go in the country, where property's cheaper, you'll often see that the best paid person is a public sector worker, right? That's, in my constituency, that's not true, right? The best paid people are private sector workers. And I just wonder the extent to which a lot of the cultural things are really reflecting economics rather than thinking about cultural questions and economics on different axes.
Which is the chicken and which is the egg?
Well, I think there's a group of academics that have tried to answer this last week from Harvard, 5 of them. and they did a kind of analysis of what's called zero-sum thinking. I know that Patrick would have seen this paper. And they tried to analyse why certain cohorts of people have zero-sum thinking. So what do I mean by that? The idea that if somebody else has something, that means I can't have it. And that's a feature of kind of quite hard kind of socialist ideals, and it's also a feature of populist right ideals. The idea that if you have something, I can't have it. And the thing they found very conclusively was that zero-sum thinking is basically almost linearly related to the amount of GDP growth in each cohort. So, Bim, you talked about millennials being structurally quite centre-left with a small grouping on the right. Zero-sum thinking there is very high because of the very low rates of growth. So I think I would argue that you're probably right. The culture shifts that we've seen are almost certainly downstream of lower GDP growth, particularly by region, right? If you track the Leave Remain vote back to 2016, one of the things it was most related to that wasn't education was house price rises and differential investment. And again, what you're seeing is different areas move. It's not necessarily the stock. It's not where they are. It's where they've been going and the trajectory, and that's hugely impacted how people think about culture.
So the longer, as a society, as a country, where our growth rate is not very high, say a trend 1.5%, say, the more left-wing voters you have in the future.
Well, 1.5 would be high. 2% used to be the goal.
I know, but I'm sort of dialing it back a little bit. Now, assuming 1.5, that's okay. So effectively, the longer that's the case, the more left-wing voters you're building for the long term.
Also populist right as well. Yeah. It's on both sides. Yeah.
Could I, just before I ask you a broader question about culture, could I just ask a couple of questions, one question off the back of Bim's, which is, I don't want to spend the whole session revisiting the Brexit referendum, but I was very struck by how during it, really sort of prosperous areas like, say, Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire's area, I know quite well, near my old constituency of High Wycombe, produced a narrow majority for Remain, but a lot of Leave voters. There's a lot of older Leave voters on good incomes who economically, you would argue, didn't have an interest in the outcome they voted for. So what happened there in terms of the trade-off between economics and culture?
Big question. I definitely will answer that question, but I really wanted to tack on something about the debate before, which was what we noticed with the sort of the polling on tax is that there is a correlation, or there's an explanation in there about the economic context, i.e. a very high tax burden. And under the previous administration, when taxes were going up, we noticed a big change in the binary question of does the state spend too much and tax too little, etc. And we saw a shift in that when taxes went up. So there is a context there, I think, that's worth thinking about in terms of these movements. Now, to answer the question, so we've done a lot of research on what I've gone and called the blue wall. Sorry, James. And it speaks directly to this phenomenon of all these areas which sort of economically look like a sort of place that should be voting one way in terms vis-a-vis Brexit referendum, Conservative Party, but are actually sort of going another way. And I think it probably leans into where this discussion is going, and it seems to be a values driver. And it seems to be something about globalism, about internationalism, about this sort of suggestion, these ideas about Britain's place in the world, that was driving a lot of thinking around sort of Remain and Leave and how that broke down among higher income groups. Education being a very, very, very important and highly strong correlate with that. And if you sort of look at these sort of blue wall areas and you're trying to figure out what's going on in them, a lot of the story is about education and the kind of values that come along with a degree and the kind of things that you're exposed to having had a degree. So I think a lot of it is in that, and a lot of it sort of how that breaks down further up the income scale and further up the age scale is about education, how that interacted with Remain, Leave, and how it continues to interact with Lib Dem Conservative right now.
Anyone else on the Beaconsfield question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think basically that the Leave vote had a number of demographic drivers, so let's just forget about structurally why the vote happened and the kind of political reasons for that and get into the cephology. The fundamental drivers are your level of education, but that moves in lockstep with your age, but the two are not the same. Yeah. And Beaconsfield has a lot of older voters. And one of the really useful things to understand the Leave Remain dynamic is actually to dovetail the two together. So, and that explains quite a bit about British politics. So one of the features of kind of liberal Democrat target seats is that they have the highest proportion of old but also university educated people. So if you know and that's, you know, if you just simply download that census map, you have something very closely approximating the Liberal Democrat vote share in England. And then again, if you change one of those variables again, so we keep higher number of older people, but we change high education to low education, you then have a map of the Conservative vote. And then if you change low education, if you change the old people to young people, you then have a Labour map. So we can carry on like that. And so Beaconsfield just kind of sits between two axes, right? Which is why it is both Conservative, Liberal facing, but also Leave and Remain, and it kind of sits in that. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I'm sort of following you through the data trail, James, several steps behind. Let me just ask a broader question about culture, because it is often argued that the Conservatives are going down a cul-de-sac about culture and should be concentrating very fixedly on economics and the public services. So I want to give an example where that seems to be right, an example where that seems to be wrong, and ask what we can draw from it. So the example that seems to be right was Black Lives Matter and taking the knee. And there was a tremendous vogue on parts of the right when it happened for saying that there would be a revolt among football supporters against players taking the knee. I mean, you know, I go to a League One team ground as often as I can. I have seen no revolt about taking the knee. I've seen bits of it here and there on TV, but far outweighed by the applause or by silence, and the general sense that people were going along with what they read as a broad protest against racism, whatever the origins of Black Lives Matter may be in the US. That didn't work. On the other hand, just consider the effect of trans self-ID in Scotland. This culture issue has been crucial in bringing down Nicola Sturgeon and collapsing the position of the SNP. So on culture, isn't it a question of kind of what, when? Can't avoid culture war, it's happening all the time, but you have to pick your ground very carefully, and that anything involving culture is ultimately always going to partly turn into this discussion about border control, immigration, multiculturalism, and all that. And you can't get away in a democracy from questions about borders and very primal views about borders, and some people believing they should be protected very strongly, and other people really believing they don't matter at all. Bim.
I mean, I think that... So just to take borders first and then the other stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, Martin Wolf's looked at this, where he's sort of, you know, and he's looked at the issue of immigration in European politics. You know, we to some degree are similar to other European democracies. And what Martin observes is that the reason why immigration became as politically salient as it became in the 2010s is because of the economic difficulty, post-financial crisis, and that raised the salience of immigration. It's not that the people who cared about it didn't care about it before necessarily, but it became much more important to them. So I think the cultural questions are one of salience as much as they are of whether you agree with somebody or not. And just on trans, because I think, you know, my colleague Miriam Cates is very fond of talking about this subject very frequently. What I always say to Miriam is, and to other colleagues is, it is really critical issue. People with kids, a lot of people have children, a lot of them are very uncomfortable with the direction that certain parts of the education establishment seem to be going on that subject, of which I share that uncomfortable nature. However, the number of people for whom that will be the main thing that drives their vote is very small. And I can tell you just the work that I did with Onward on younger people and sort of millennials, and we did a series of focus groups, and I was struck watching the focus groups, trying to get people to talk about these cultural issues when they were talking about economics was impossible. They were just like, why are you talking to me about this? It just doesn't matter very much. It's not that they didn't have views on it, they just didn't think it mattered very much. And I think that that is a danger if you become too focused on certain things that are too marginal to too many people, that's what opposition looks like. So that's why I think as a party, we should be focusing on what matters most to most people, rather than the other way around.
Frank?
I agree with all of that. I mean, to be even more cynical, I sometimes wonder, is it easy to talk about those issues because they're sort of free, and it's much more expensive to deal with things that people actually care about, or just much harder in policy terms and will require much more complex and long-term solutions? And is there a bet that either the polling is wrong and that more people care about these things but are unwilling to say them, and that there's something latent that people are tapping into? I don't know. It just seems like a waste of space in the public debate when there's so many more important things to be talking about.
Just, James, just to put the contrary view for a moment, Bim made a point about salience, and that seems to me absolutely right. But it follows from that you don't know when something suddenly will become salient, which is what happened to the trans debate in Scotland. Suddenly, at one moment, it is as obscure and as background an issue as you would describe in your conversation about a focus group and what matters to it. Then suddenly, because of the speed of events, it's transformed right to the top of reporting. Does that make any difference?
Well, let me take a couple of steps back. So we started the question and the conversation on the issue of Black Lives Matter, and you were noting the effect of football crowds, and I think that's part of a much longer history of leadership and then people following leadership. So I think my favourite academic paper in politics is an analysis of what happened to the US's GIs who were black when they were settled here in the UK in World War II. And what was extraordinary is they found a long-term 30, 40-year tail of anti-racist attitudes across every single area that had located 1945 GIs from America who were black. And for me, that's like a really good apocryphal tale of what leadership kind of looks like in contact theory. And I think that's basically what you would have seen in the football stadium. And I think here we talk about these big cultural issues, like they're big, impregnable, kind of static buildings that are there. So, there's the anti-immigration building, there's the really pro-migration building, there's the anti-trans building, there's the really pro-trans. And actually the British public are very, very flexible across all the issues. So we've seen in the last couple of weeks a lot of polling on immigration. So I think James Johnson polled Suella Braverman's speech and saw that kind of parts of it were extremely popular. Then there's other polling that's been conducted that shows that the UK public is in the most pro-migration place it's been for 15 years, and everyone's kind of scratching their heads, being like,
exactly.
who's got the fake data? And I think that's what your question is about. And I think sometimes we just have to accept that there exists lots of people with pretty layered, what I would call layered views, which is that you can believe, for example, that there are costs to immigration, there are negatives to it, but also at the same time that we really need it. And then there are people who will be the opposite of that, who don't need it, but they really like it. And I think that's just where we are. And I think a lot of the complexity of UK debate has been melted away by kind of constant politicisation of our kind of national discourse. And I think when we start to all become a bit less political, we'll start to see this nuance a bit more.
Yeah, I think a key thing there is voters are a la carte diners. They don't really have ideologies. They don't really think about things in terms of a set menu. They're very much like, I like a bit of that policy. I like a bit of that. This matters to me. That matters to me. And that's my sort of my set of beliefs, and that's what I'm going to be looking for in my politics. So there's many layers of public opinion. There's many different ways, and I think a lot of the immigration polling that's kicking around now, it comes down to framing, and it comes down to how you ask the questions and what the specifics that you talk about elicits very different responses from voters depending on how you're asking them about the same topic. And to perhaps push even more on the academic direction, there's a wonderful set of papers by a guy called Chris Flasian over in the States. And what he talks about, it kind of goes as far back as Jim Stimson in the 1980s, talking about this idea of thermostatic politics. And basically, this is a really, really fantastic theory of change, and it applies to economics, and I think it applies to social change as well, in that when movements happen in the political and social space, what we observe is a push in a given direction. So right now that might be sort of the trans debate, or it could be immigration a few years ago, and there's a push in one direction. And the median sort of voter, the median person, will look at that push, and usually they'll say, no, that's a bit too far. And they'll kind of pull in the other direction. And then what this kind of creates is this kind of dovetailing until change eventually settles. And it usually always settles in a given direction. It doesn't usually regress to the mean. So change is never linear. And that applies sort of in economic values and social values as well. It's pushed and it's pulled and then it settles. And then something else comes and does the same thing. So I think that's probably what we're seeing a lot of at the moment in a lot of the cultural debates, is this kind of this push and pull, and it'll settle somewhere.
Where do you think we are in the economic debate on that? Because one thing that I've noticed post-COVID, and I don't know how, if this is borne out in the data, never stopped me before, has something happened to the British public in the way it thinks about government and tax and spend post-COVID? Because I found as a politician, it feels different now than a few years ago. And I don't think it's about Boris or Liz or Rishi. I don't think it's about that. I think there's something post-COVID seems to have changed. Are you seeing any of that?
Yes, and I think I think it's about COVID, and I think it's also about the tax burden, to be quite honest. I think a lot of people feel like they're paying a lot of tax and are not seeing all that much for it. And that's kind of coming up against another view which they have, which is that, wow, didn't COVID show us the extent of what the state can do in a crisis situation? So there's a lot of, sort of, to go back to the layering and to go back to the a la carte thing, there's a lot of things going on right now and a lot of developed and different ways of thinking about the state and its relationship with individuals and its relationship with income, which wasn't really there, let's say in 2015 particularly, was changed around sort of the austerity era as well. And there was sort of a strong sense that, yes, the state should be getting smaller and debt needs to be coming down, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not conversations right now that voters are interested in at all. They're interested in solutions. And they're interested in the ways that what's going on can be sort of solved by the state.
Right, who wants to come in? I'm going to take two. I'm going to take the lady there and the gentleman there. If you'd like to say who you are, that'd be.
Thanks.
Yes.
I'm Juliette Phillips. I work for E3G, which is an independent climate change think tank. It was mentioned earlier in the panel that renters have been particularly hard hit by the cost of living crisis. I think housing is a really important issue for young people, and I think there's a growing sense that renters are being let down. There's been no sign of the Renters Reform Bill, which came into the House in May, and I think a couple of weeks ago the government scrapped energy efficiency standards for renters, which could have saved them £8 billion over the next decade in energy costs. So my question for the panel is, what can the Conservatives offer to renters and young people if they want to gain their votes? Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Will Brett from We're Right Here, the Campaign for Community Power. Could the panel reflect on the second bit of the title, Low on Trust? If you're politicians facing a really fundamentally skeptical, cynical public, where the context is politicians aren't trusted, government isn't believed that they can deliver, what can you say? We've got an answer, we think it's about community power, but really keen to hear what the panel says.
Who wants to go first? Frank?
I mean, on renting it, it's a really good question. My sense is, though, that there is almost nothing the Conservatives could say to young voters to get their votes at this point, given how often they have let down that particular group of the population while in office and where they've put their bets thus far. But as always, it would be the usual things around security of tenancy, more affordable housing. But I just don't see it happening at all. I think they've chosen their side on the housing debate, and they're not going to do very much.
Well, Ben, what do you think about that?
I don't think that's quite right. I think that, yes, all of those things, tenure and a lot of the legal changes, energy, they all matter. But I think the thing that matters the most is the cost. Is we have to show renters that they can rent at low cost and have a successful life, with the hope most of them will have that in future they can buy. And it's really about cost. And we have to do some quite big, radical things around housing, focused on younger people, to show younger people that we're actually serious. I don't actually think, tinkering, or even not tinkering, doing some quite big legal things around renters' rights is actually going to move the dial if your cost is too high. I think that cost is the most important thing. And without that, nothing else is going to be significant. But just on your point around trust, I can remember being at university I was there 2004 to 2007, and I can distinctly remember a particular point where people were saying, there was a debate at the union when people were saying, look, how do we get politicians more trusted? Politicians aren't trusted. And I sort of think now people look back at that time and see it as a golden era where everything was wonderful and everybody loved politicians. And the truth is, I think to some degree that's always the case. In a skeptical, well-educated democracy, it's right that people are skeptical of these weirdos who decide that they want to order them about for 5 years. Like, that's quite normal, actually. Well, not us, but the voters. It's quite normal. So the way you build trust is you build trust by showing that you understand priorities and are moving towards a better outcome. And we've done it before. We've done it on loads of different things. And so we just need to remember that if you improve people's lives, they do actually notice. And yeah, they come back and say, okay, you did that. I want you to do more. But that's part of how you improve as a society and as a country.
What about what Tony Blair called this big question about trust?
I'm a bit more pessimistic than you, Bim.
I'm in the optimism business.
Yeah. The graphs are very optimistic. I'll answer that with a story and then some data. So for those of you, no one's paid me to say this, but Stanley Tucci has got a great BBC documentary about Italy and food on BBC iPlayer. I'd highly recommend it. The reason being, the episode where he goes to Lombardy is one of the most kind of brilliant political science episodes that you can get. So he basically kind of wanders around the farmers of Lombardy, and then he goes into kind of the centre of Milan. And obviously the voting patterns he talks about with people who live there. So he's out there with the cheesemakers and the kind of farmers in Lombardy who are kind of voting for kind of 5-star and flirt with the far right. And then he goes into Milan and he talks to a lot of the kind of students and kind of urban workers who structurally vote on the left. And the thing he reflects on at the end of the episode is he says it's really interesting that the people in Milan and outer Lombardy all like each other, trust each other, and are invested in each other's success. And he said that's really unique. If I was to go to a US city and go right into the centre and then empty out, there's a kind of zero-sum game lack of trust between communities. And he said it's not a coincidence. This is like one of the highest income, most productive areas and has been for literally thousands of years. And I think for me that was a really strong lesson. We don't really, when we talk about the productivity crisis, we don't talk about the economic crisis, we don't really link the two to the fact that we have a low trust society and then we have an economic problem as if they're two kind of discrete problems. The sense is they're probably almost certainly kind of connected. If you look and you model, which Patrick's made a living out of that, levels of trust by area in the country and constituency, it's very, very linked to kind of things like GDP growth and absolute economic performance. So I think, forget just the social issues that we have, massive crisis of trust across democracies, it might also be related to the kind of economic story as well.
Patrick?
Yeah, and there's perhaps a correlation-causation argument here, but trust correlates very negatively with populism. And it correlates very negatively with what they call in the literature's centre and periphery style arrangements, where you have some kind of argumentation or some kind of political profile that constructs a group of people who are in the middle, who have control, who have the power, who are making the decisions, and then the people that are on the outside, away from everything, who don't have control, aren't consulted, don't make any decisions, and that is problematic. And then you put people into those groups, and then you say this is why everything is bad, and you should vote for us or support our cause or whatever. It manifests in many, many different ways, and that is a negative driver of trust, because if people are constantly told that these people are terrible human beings that don't listen to you and you need to get rid of them, that manifests as a more widely sort of held belief that there is this centre, there is this elite or whatever, and I'm not part of it, and we need to get rid of them, and I don't trust anything that's going on in there. So, there's a bit of a chicken and egg argument. Perhaps does populism drive trust, as trust drive populism, but the two things are negatively correlated.
Two more. Gentleman, and then anyone else? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm from National Children's Bureau, and children can't vote but are deeply affected by the cost of living crisis. What do you think Conservatives can do to alleviate the effects of cost of living on children and as the voters of the future?
Sorry, it's Randy Ramesh, I write for The Guardian. Do you think it's a problem that sometimes politicians sloganise and voters take the wrong message? I think of the war on motorists and James' analysis that in low-density areas you find a lot of Tory voters. Well, they might not see a war on motorists unless they try and get an insurance premium this year, and they'll find it shot up. And it might sort of, by sending people to this space where they're worried about car prices, they might start blaming the government rather than thinking they're doing anything for them.
Right, who wants to cut Bim?
Okay. On children, I mean, the way I would think about it is, I mean, the obvious answer is, well, help the parents, and if the families are better off, the children will be better off. I think that one underexplored area of policy by this party for generations of leaderships and time is family, and thinking about families and thinking about how we build better families and more successful families. And I do pay tribute to Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates, for really thinking deeply about these questions, because not enough people do. And I think a politics that thinks more about families and how to keep families together, how to improve their prosperity, all of the things that we know matter actually way more than schools, I think could make a difference on cost of living and other things. And on slogans, if you get your slogans right, people know exactly what you're talking about. And in my experience, the PM and people around the PM are, broadly speaking, very well cited on focus group data, polling data. So when you hear slogans, they have a pretty good feel for that information. And Isaac Levido is a very talented guy who also is advising on those questions. So I have faith that they have scoped out properly what the electorate is thinking.
Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Bim has said. I mean, ultimately, what is necessary for children to thrive is a sense of security, right? So that's both about adequate, stable incomes coming into the home. It's about good health, it's about good education, but it's also, as Bim says, space for families to care. So in terms of thinking about whatever economic reforms we look at, how do we continue to kind of enable people to look after their children, provide them with the time and space that they need, in addition to also earning the money to keep everything ticking.
James?
I'll take the family kind of question. I broadly agree, Bim. It's kind of, there hasn't been much political space open for that. The data is very clear that stronger, happier families that feel well resourced and are able to kind of both work and have leisure time are kind of units that you kind of build countries on. And it's not very fashionable. Usually it's kind of Ian Duncan Smith, and he's been talking about it for a long time as well. But not a lot of people put attention to that, and I wonder why. I wonder if there's a selection bias going on in terms of our politics and the type of people we represent. Because if you think about it, to go into politics is to put your family second.
I'd appreciate if that wasn't recorded or sent out or tweeted anywhere.
So I think, yeah, you probably just hit on a selection bias issue there, Ben.
Ran Deep's question about the war on motorists sort of literally rebounding.
Yeah, I was thinking, reminded me a bit of the AA. They always gone about that, didn't they? So, but sometimes the vagueness in slogans is entirely by design. So if you think about "Get Brexit Done," that can mean, and it did mean so many different things to different people, or like just vote leave. That means a lot of different things for different people. It allowed people, and it allows people today to still project onto this concept, this political debate, this argument, this side of the fence, whatever they wanted it to mean. Could it be about immigration? Could it be about sovereignty? Could it be about economics? Whatever. The idea there is to kind of, let people do it. Make America great again. GB energy. All of these things are things which are kind of, by intention and by their nature, space to allow people to put what they think and they feel and project into it to support it. So I think definitely sometimes they are vague, and sometimes I think that's entirely by design.
Okay, look, sadly we've run out of time, and this conversation could have gone and did go in so many places. I've just a very quick last question for everyone on the very title of this event about the Conservatives keeping hold of lower income voters and voters who are under pressure. Is this conference making any difference? Is it helping, harming, or actually making no difference at all to the Conservatives' electoral pitch? Frank?
No, I think words are very cheap right now, and actually what's driving politics are events. The only thing that will enable the Conservatives to regain ground is if the economy really turns around quite quickly over the next 10 to 12 months.
Patrick, is this conference making any difference? And indeed, do conferences make any difference, really?
You'd be not surprised to know, I'm sure, that most voters don't even know that conferences are going on.
Yep.
But I think that there is something to be said about the wider sense in which, what comes out of the conferences in terms of how the people who are there perceive where the parties are at. Is there a narrative of unity? Is there a narrative of, they've got a plan? Is there a narrative of this idea that there's a direction that's being pulled in? And I think there's been various incidences in what's going on at this conference which would suggest that the mood music that comes out of that and then sets the tone of reporting in general for the next few months is probably going to be no. So I think that bit is important, the specifics of what goes on and who's having coffee with who, less so.
James?
I think it's the kind of inflation numbers that matter, the real numbers.
Fine. Bim, I left you till last. After all, you are a Conservative Member of Parliament.
I think that not just inflation, but I think the amount of take-home pay that people have for your average person, I'll leave you with this stat, the median weekly earnings, median, not the mean, have barely moved in 15 years for your average person. And think of all the costs that have gone up in that time. Not just housing, but all sorts of other costs, right? So, we have got to, as a party, focus on average earnings for average people. That's both economic growth, it's opportunity, but it's also taxes. For graduates, it's student debt. I think that is the biggest thing that is driving our politics right now. And unless we can get that up, it's really going to be difficult next year.
On which note, I'm sorry we haven't got more time, but Frank, James, Patrick, and Bim, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.